Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Today, the co-host is Chris Rossini. Chris, good to have you with us today. Good. I want to talk a little bit about an individual that's been in the news this past week, and there's been a lot of interest, and that is a member of the President's cabinet. He's the Attorney General, and ordinarily, I do not volunteer too much advice for other people. I like to talk about ideas. I think if somebody doesn't ask me for advice, it's not worth much. But today, I'm going to break my own rules. We're going to give some advice here. And the advice is, Mr. President, why don't you fire this guy? Why don't you fire Jeff Sessions? He seems to be a menace. He's undoing some positive steps forward in curtailing some abuse of civil liberties, but he's taking a big step backward on this war on drugs. So I don't know, Chris, do you think we're going to be overstating our position if we're gently, but with a bit of force, to let the president know that he ought to really consider firing this guy? I don't think the country would be less well off.
Yes, and many people were surprised when he hired him in the first place, knowing his record. But Mr. Trump did. And the drug war, Dr. Paul, as we all know, is universally considered virtually a total failure. But once government gets started with something, even when it's a failure, getting rid of it is very tough because of their power of taxation. They take money and they just keep pumping it into failed businesses like Wall Street or the Postal Service or the schools, and we could go on and on. So getting rid of a failure is tough. But the states have been, one by one, going on their own because it's such a bad failure, this drug war. And now Jeff Sessions is trying to stand in the way.
That is right, and it's done more or less outside immediate consultation, even with the president, it seems, or with the Congress. But Obama had changed the rules on this. He made it so that the Justice Department could back off on these vicious enforcement of the laws that have been on the books, even though there have been attempts and laws passed where there was plenty of room for not enforcing these laws. The first one could be the Constitution, because they're being enforced in an unconstitutional sense. So Obama lightens up, and that is the reason he more or less gave a green light to the states that they can start living under their own laws, which, sound like a pretty good victory for states' rights and nullification. But along comes, Sessions now, and he's reversing that. It's all done by a memo. It's not even considered an executive order. It's a memo that says, okay, the Justice Department, the officials can do what they are, do what they want, and encourage them to use a strong enforcement of these laws. And it's created a lot of questions among the state officials. One having been the fact that they were looking forward to a lot of revenues, coming in from taxing this. I think that's one of the worst reasons to, legalize something, and because it's going to generate more revenue. Matter of fact, that's how some of these laws got started. It had to do with revenues, and it's because they're afraid to discuss the real issue of liberty, freedom of choice, who takes the risk, and where does this authority come from in the Constitution. They avoid this, and they generally use the power to tax. Even though the original Constitution didn't have an income tax, the authority for the federal government to tax, unfortunately, was there. So they used this, and they've been using it in the effort to regulate drugs for a long time. The Harrison Act, 1914, it was a tax act. It put a tax on, the drugs. It wasn't a prohibition because they knew they couldn't do this. And then, of course, in 1937, it wasn't a prohibition, a federal prohibition against marijuana. It was a tax that was so high that nobody could use it. And then they enforced it, illegally. And then again, I think about the Obamacare. They knew they couldn't do certain things, but they had the power to tax. So the Supreme Court stretches this and said, oh, it's a tax, then it's okay to destroy private practice, and they go on and on. But here and now, once again, they're talking about taxes. And even when they legalize drugs, to me, it's a disappointment because there's 100 different things you got to watch for, in guidelines. They never talk about who should be making a decision on taking a risk, And who has the authority to be involved? Does the federal government have the authority to be involved? No, they just say that people might not act responsibly, therefore they have to have the government come in. I think it's interesting to find out that marijuana, matter of fact, they claim that they knew about marijuana 5,000 years ago. I haven't checked that out, but I bet they have been using marijuana for a long, long time. And just think, this is only recent history that these laws were written. When you think about the real vicious attack was 1937, and it was a tax. It wasn't a prohibition. I think also it's interesting that, when they wanted to have prohibition of alcohol, they knew they couldn't do that. That was obviously abuse to the Constitution, and therefore what they did was they just put a tax on it because they could get away with it, and then for alcohol they amended the Constitution. But today there's so little respect for it. So I was hoping we'd see a sort of an opening here, with the drug laws and repeal the war on drugs. A war on drugs should be called the war on liberty. And I think we'd get a lot further along if we dealt with it on principle rather than this tinkering on the edges of pretending that they really care about states' rights.
No, they don't. And the way it's being liberalized is not ideal. As we all know, politicians love money, and Colorado, I read, has already collected hundreds of millions in taxes. So this is a financial incentive, and kind of like a carrot, like, oh, look at all the money you could make in order to move towards liberty. At least if government's confiscating money, it's better than them killing people and throwing people into cages for smoking a plant, and all the bad drugs that are out there, making people go to drug dealers. All of it is nonsense. So we could go after the taxes later, as long as we get a little bit of liberty to, choose what you could do with your own body and your own self, because you do own yourself and not some bureaucrat from Washington.
Maybe there will be some attention given to the discussion we're having today, because even this week, the Freedom Caucus in Congress, I wouldn't say they're hardcore libertarians. They certainly have libertarian leanings, and they're good conservatives. But they think that Sessions is not a good attorney general, and they were suggesting to the president that maybe he ought to resign. They didn't ask him to get fired. But it's interesting what their beef is, which is a correct one, because in a way, here we have Sessions out there doing a lot of things he shouldn't be doing, enforcing these very, very vicious anti-smoking and drug laws. At the same time, he's saying that we should do this at all. So I think it's very interesting that the Freedom Caucus is doing this, but they're complaining that he hasn't done enough to look into Hillary affairs. And I think that's legitimate, all this scandal going on. And the truth is I don't know all the details, but for some reason I strongly suspect that there's a great deal of bias in this investigation. And I'm not a great defender of Trump, but I think he's getting ripped off on some of these accusations. And a true investigation should be done. If you had an attorney general that was concerned, maybe he should. And I think the Freedom Caucus has a point that maybe Sessions should be doing more of that and a lot less of this drug enforcement laws.
Yeah, absolutely. And we looked at his voting record, and almost across the board, he's just real bad. Voted on extending the Patriot Act, roving wiretaps, voted no on requiring a FISA court warrant to monitor U.S. phone calls to foreign phone calls. So, I mean, when it comes to our privacy, our liberty, Jeff Sessions is not a fan whatsoever, which is why many people are like, why is Trump hiring Sessions in the first place? So it is good to see with the House Freedom Caucus, and the more pressure applied, the better, in our opinion.
Indirectly, I think what Sessions is doing is increasing the odds of more racism in this country. And they'll say, what are you talking about? He's not a racist, this sort of thing. But If you look back at the laws, even back in the Harrison Act, it was motivated by the Mexicans coming over here, and they were smoking this stuff, and it was a racist issue. Even in 1937, it was racist. They were going to punish Mexican immigrants because they were using this terrible, terrible drugs. Seems like a lot of Americans have learned to use it since then. But it definitely was racism. And the laws are vicious. And this is one place where I truly believe racism exists in this country. I think it's the last place. It has nothing to do with the charges of racism from the radical left. Always saying, that the black people need affirmative action and all these things that I think are just, trying to correct a problem that doesn't exist. But I do believe it's in the judicial system. If you look at what's been happening, if you look at all the drug dealers in the country, there's 16% of them are black drug dealers. That's probably close to the population. But if you look at the arrests of people who are dealing drugs, 49% are blacks. And then if you go to the next step, what percent are put in prison? 74% of the people put in prison for drugs are black. Now, there's something awfully suspicious about that. Blacks are poor, they're in the inner city, and some prosecutor has to make a name for himself. They don't have good protection, and there's all kinds of excuses. But does that mean that there aren't problems there? There's a lot of problems. But the biggest problem is this lack of necessity to have all these laws and locking people up. And then you add on to this the private ownership of prisons. You have some people for religious reasons, and you have people who run prisons, and you have people who think they're doing good work, God's work, by telling people not to do drugs. And they use all these things, but it adds up. I think it's a very bad situation. And if they expand now all these arrests and violations, Sessions has endorsed, asset forfeitures and SWAT teams and all these things that just violate liberties, which would disappear to a large degree. They wouldn't be associated with drugs anyway. So people say, well, this is crazy. Who ever heard of not having laws against drugs? United States of America didn't have them. Up until 1914, there were no laws. And how often do people go back and read the history? Sure, there was abuse, but it goes back to this whole concept of who's supposed to, decide on risk. Who's going to take a risk and do risky behavior? This is using drugs as a risky behavior. There's a risk in going to doctors giving you too many drugs, and you have to be careful. But risk is supposed to be managed in a free society by the individual, not by the do-gooders who have ulterior motives. And that, I think, is what's going on. So, in a way, I'm not predicting it's going to happen because I don't think Sessions is going to be as successful as he thinks. But I think if he is this successful, I think it will just continue this discrepancy on who's going to be arrested. And that to me is a real shame. And of course, economics comes into this play too, because the economic system we have right now encourages and endorses poverty over the benefits to the very wealthy, and poverty plays a part in this too. But I think there's a lot of good reasons why we should give up on this war on drugs. And I think the most important justification for getting rid of it is a liberty society, people who believe in liberty. I do not believe our Attorney General has the vaguest idea what civil liberties mean, and that he in his heart probably believes he's doing the Lord's work. But he is misled, and this activity is being misled. And the president appointed him, and he knew what his voting record was like. He's even criticized Sessions in public, which was pretty harsh, and people say, is this guy going to hang around? But then he goes around and supports what he does. But I think, Chris, maybe there's some positive things that may come of this. At least I'm always looking for the positive things that might come from an incident like this.
I'd like to close on a positive note, I hope. And that's, there are people out there like Sessions, there's tons of them, and they gravitate to government when they have this lust to dominate others and tell people what to do. Government is the perfect vehicle for them. And the first place that they like to start is with our minds. And we're bombarded from all angles, whether it be in the news or Hollywood or in schools. It's all to, so that we can obey, authority. And after the mind comes, what are we left with? Our body. So that's what the drug war is a war on. Our ability to choose and what we put into our body. It doesn't have to start with drugs. They can move on to foods and everything else. So it's important for us to just say no and take control of our minds, our bodies, and live them the way that we would like to, the way that we were intended to.
In spite of, this setback, I think it's going to be minor. Matter of fact, I'm going to stick to an argument I've made 30 years ago, that one day the American people will wake up and say this drug war is idiotic. That is what we did, in the 20s, and there was the repeal of prohibition. And because it didn't make any sense. It's not quite as dramatic, but it's been happening. The libertarians deserve a lot of credit for this. And the principle of nullification by the states, don't obey, don't follow, neutralize and nullify vicious federal laws. That principle, has generally been undermined. But right now, I think it's alive and well. I don't think Sessions is going to win this. And one thing that I don't endorse is the fact that the people who are looking forward to collecting taxes will be on our side, that, that we not do this. But I'll tell you what, I think there's a lot of people who understand the damage done. And one other fact that I didn't mention a minute ago is that the people who take the drugs suffer the consequences, and the law enforcement is so discriminatory. For instance, crack cocaine and powder cocaine, and that's another reason why blacks get more punishment than whites. But I think there's enough people now that have seen the detriment. A lot of people ask me, how in the world did you run in the 70s and 80s and 90s and had this position in the Bible Belt? Nobody would have answered a questionnaire at that time that the percentage of people who were for getting rid of the drug war were very, very small. But I won the elections, and my suspicion was that almost every family had been touched one way or another by the vicious violations of rights and the destruction of life by hauling kids off to prison for this. And so I think the people were further along. I always think the people were further along than the Congress. And right now, I think that movement in that direction and the realization has happened. I think we're there, and they're not going to cancel it out. I just want to urge, let's not make the argument the right to smoke a joint. That is not my point, but it's maybe the right to do it, but it's a liberty issue, the right to make your own decisions, and it's not a narrow issue of just a permission to use this particular drug. It should be the following the Constitution. This idea, the one other argument they use for the supremacy clause, that any kind of conflict between the states and the federal government, the Supreme Court of the land and the Supreme Court in the Constitution says so, which is a lie. Read the 10th Amendment. That doesn't say that. There's a supremacy clause that is dealing with those issues that both the state and the federal government are involved in. Then there is a conflict, like anything in Article 1, Section 8. If there's a dispute over there, that then would be the case. But no, the supremacy of the federal government has been grossly distorted, and that's why we have that monster in Washington. But anyway, I'm going to finish with a positive note and saying Sessions is not going to win. Because the people have awakened. He's going to hear from them. There's going to be a lot of noise made, and people who are collecting those taxes are going to see this as an a time to come down hard on them. So I vote for liberty and responsibility, and that I think wins out in the long run. But if we win on this issue, we have a lot of other issues that we have to work on as well. Chris, I want to thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paul.
And I want to thank our viewers today for tuning in, and please come back soon to the Liberty Report.